I want to open my talk today with a reflection by Val McDermid from a book that's fittingly titled Future. And this is from Val McDermid, who writes, "We are living in a time of chaos. We are living in a time of fear. We are living in a time of uncertainty. What we need now is the confidence to rewrite the script. But if we're truly going to do that, we need imagination. We need to imagine both what will happen if we sit back and do nothing, and also what could happen if we challenge the future and change it." So widely phrased as this is, McDermid's opening to the Future collection can be applied to a variety of contemporary crises, including those surrounding borders and the environmental crisis, which is those that I'm really focused on. It can be used as a prompt to think about borders, the borders that we draw, so that we might draw them more flexibly, more democratically, more sustainable or humanitarian in the future. Equally, it can prompt us to think about ways of tackling the environmental challenges that threaten our planetary futures, or indeed it might ask us to address both of these questions at once. We are also living in a time when we are simultaneously facing a crisis of borders and an environmental crisis. And the intricate connections between those two have been eliminated starkly through the COVID-19 pandemic in recent years. The examination of the interdependencies between bordering processes and environmental concerns therefore deserve urgent attention. And deliberately undefined, the we in this passage by McDermid is addressed to all of us to imagine possible paths towards the future. And in this talk today, I want to explore a forward-looking vision for Scottish studies and advocate for new methodologies that transcend the traditional historicist and nationalist frameworks that have long shaped the discipline of Scottish literary studies. These new approaches can illuminate, I think, the role of Scottish literature in addressing global and planetary crises, particularly those related to national borders and the planetary environment. So what I want to talk about is centrally a methodological provocation, a suggestion for rewriting the script of Scottish studies, if you will. It's a shorter version of what I explore in my monograph, which is, I've got here, and which was already introduced by Ron. So it was recently published by Bloomsbury, and thanks to very generous funding I got, it's also open access, so you can read it online if you want to know more about it. I also got some spare print copies if anyone is interested in reviewing the book for any kind of publication, just get in touch. So in my research, I explore how Scottish writers use forms, specifically the forms of the literal, planetarity, and territory to rethink borders and the environment. But for this talk, I don't want to dive into all the histories or theoretical debates that I explore in the book, which is really focused on interdisciplinarity. But I want to reflect on how literature imagines the complex ties between borders and the environment and suggest some new directions for the field via some literary examples. So in the spirit of the title of this talk and in answer to Val McDermid's call for action and imagination, scholars and readers of Scottish literature might consider some of the following questions. Can Scottish literature help us face our contemporary challenges? And if not, do we approach it in the right way? How could we rewrite the script of Scottish studies as an academic discipline to address the planetary challenges that we are facing? In what ways can we engage Scottish literature and Scottish literary studies to challenge the future and change it as McDermid would have it? These questions can only be answered communally, of course, but they must be asked if we want to face the immensity of the environmental and humanitarian crises of the 21st century rather than just sit back. Creative works from the late 2010s and early 2020s, such as Sarah Hall's The Wolf Border, John Lanchester's The Wall, and Ali Smith's Spring, not only display the vital connection between borders and the environment, but they also highlight the special affordances offered by an inclusion of a Scottish context for thinking through this correlation. The crossing of the Anglo-Scottish borders by the wolves around which the plot of The Wolf Border revolves is one of the key moments in the novel. And according to Tim Baker, it achieves an elimination of borders in favor of a new politics beyond parties and policies. Lanchester's The Wall, set at different sections of a gigantic wall built to save mainland Britain from rising sea levels, imagines Scotland, in Kirsten Sandrock's words, as a crucial site, and I quote Sandrock, where the institutionalized boundaries of the nation-state are temporarily undermined. Ali Smith's Spring is the third installment of a seasonal quartet that is, as a whole, attuned to the correlation between borders and the environment. It is the only novel of the quartet that's partially set in Scotland, and the elusive Anglo-Scottish border takes on a symbolic significance. Not only can the refugee girl Florence not see the border, but she can also cross it without consequence, which leads her into muse on the idea of borders as contact zones rather than divisive lines. While England, is hostile to migrants in the novel and will prefer to wall itself in, Scotland is thus presented as a friendlier and more welcoming place. It is in the Cairngorms that the protagonists of the novel come to meet, and it is in Scotland that refugees receive help and assistance from an organisation calling themselves the Old Alliance. In all of these works, Scotland's of a distinct focus to approach the correlation between borders and the environment from a contemporary view, and we can also see this correlation playing out historically, and we'll get to that in a bit. But before diving into specific examples, let me briefly set up the context for exploring the topics of borders and the environment through Scotland. And apologies in advance if this is getting a little bit theoretical. I promise we'll get through it quickly, but I think it's necessary to follow the ideas. So, since its inception in the early 20th century, Scottish studies has been haunted by the lack of an organic literary and cultural tradition. This constitutes, in the words of Edwin Muir, the predicament of the Scottish writer. Famously described as a nation without a history suffering from schizophrenia, Scotland was, in the words of Cairns Craig, quote, doomed to failure by history, geography, by ideology, unquote. Not being able to define itself through shared language, cultural or literary heritage, state power, or geopolitical borders, Scottish critics thus found unity in a shared pathological condition. This pathological condition, defined in 1919 by Gregory Smith as a specific form of schizophrenia that characterized the Scots and which he termed the Caledonian Antisyzygy, has long been used by critics to describe and define a specifically Scottish literary tradition. But what would happen if we turned the supposed predicament on its head? As right-wing nationalism surges across Europe and the idea of the nation-state is increasingly questioned, the old model of reading Scottish literature as inherently flawed becomes increasingly less convincing. Instead, I would suggest we should ask, what happens if instead of reading Scottish literature and culture as inherently flawed and unsettled, we concentrate on the alternative perspectives and trajectories that the special situation of Scotland might engender? What if the very things that have been seen as weaknesses, contradictions, ambiguities, and marginalizations are actually affordances, positives that allow for a rethinking of the conventional understanding of borders and the environment and how they structure society, literature, and history? Carla Sassi suggests that these contradictions define Scottish literature as anomalous, a country marginalized for centuries, unable to define itself either as a nation-state or a minority culture, with a conflicted post-colonial status. Yet both Carla Sassi and Bertolt Schoene understand Scotland's anomaly to be thoroughly advantageous from a 21st century viewpoint, when national unity and the proliferation of borders are increasingly questioned. And it's in this spirit that I propose to read the predicament of Scottish literature as a unique affordance that turns it precisely into an interesting arena for exploring wider social and environmental debates. Susan Stanford Friedman's questions about the temporalities offered by transnational literary research serve me as a useful framework for reevaluation of Scottish literature beyond geopolitical and temporary confines. Friedman asks, instead of falling back all too easily into periods of literary history as markers of national literary history, can we develop what have been variously called transnational, global, or planetary approaches, without giving up the rigorous historical and geographic contextualization of points of production and reception. Similarly, eco-critic Timothy Clark criticizes the limitation of historicist approaches and methodological nationalism in the context of the Anthropocene. He writes that the focus of critique is on the specific time-honored notion that to understand the text is to reconstruct its context. Yet putting it back in context is something that must become more problematic when we are forced to consider issues which, in however minute a way, require both planetary and even futural contexts. What is needed then, Clark argues, is a methodology that takes the environmental crisis as a prompt to question the basic conceptions of the human, the social, the cultural. His multi-scalar reading practice aligns with new formalist and post-critical strategies, encouraging us to focus on the affordances and creative possibilities within texts. My interest in my research lies in the forms and models developed by Scottish literary works and in exploring how they may speak across geographic and temporal boundaries. Of course, it would be naive to deny the material effects of borders, because borders and bordering processes do influence the production of works of literature, whether they locate themselves within a national tradition or outside of it. Borders, both literary, matter, but they must also be problematized. As Eleanor Bell has pointed out, and this is also on the slide, if nations are now potentially subject to reconfiguration, then similarly, the notion of national traditions can no longer be uncritically assumed. So the affordances that I see in Scottish literature are not rooted in any form of national consciousness that is perceived or exercised by the writers themselves, but they arise in the context of a practice that I call thinking through Scotland. And by this, I understand an acute awareness of and a dialogue with Scotland's geographical, environmental, and socio-political situation. The practice of thinking through Scotland is pertinent for a situated understanding of Scotland, while also moving beyond this rather narrow scope. It means identifying formal arrangements and developing models that may fruitfully be transposed to other contexts or complemented in the form of comparative approaches. Examining how Scottish writers of the past and present are thinking through Scotland allows access to an environmental perspective on Scotland's borders and provides new insights into the relationship between borders and the environment more widely. So I want to offer you some examples that illuminate the potential and methodological and theoretical directions for Scottish studies of the future that is attuned to these environmental concerns and that understands borders, including the borders of national literary traditions and disciplines, as dynamic and flexible constructs. The examples I share are not definitive, but rather suggestive. So they're an invitation for you as well to think across texts, geographies, genres, and periods, and to see meaning as something that's always open to reinvention and transformation. Reading, I believe, is much like bordering, a collaborative and open-ended activity in which meaning remains continually open. So far from wanting to give you a full picture of 2 centuries of Scottish writing, which I don't think could be achieved in this short amount of time, the readings are meant as a suggestion, and I hope you can think of some other examples or connections to the text that I speak about. And I'd love to hear about your thoughts or your examples. So one way in which writers have thought through Scotland is by entering into dialogue with its literal environments. The 2 examples I will show you make use of the literal as a central critical lens and as a literary form to reimagine borders. Ecologically, a littoral zone is defined as a transitional area between 2 ecosystems shared by their respective biological communities, and it can be found on the nearshore area of lakes, seas, and other bodies of water. In addition, the littoral also constitutes a cultural and literary field of tension. Ecological understandings overlap with the cultural, political, and literary imaginaries of coasts, beaches, and shores. Frequently, littoral borders delineate national borders. Coastal geographies and their imaginaries are also often instrumentalized to reinforce insular national identities and they render visible the violent actualities and effects of the policing of borders, as when bodies wash up on the shore. The literal consequently emerges as an acutely relevant form for thinking through the connections I'm interested in, and it is a central form for Scottish writers. In 2020 and 2021, Scotland organised the Year of Coasts and Waters, celebrating and showcasing Scotland's coasts and water bodies and highlighting the role of water for Scotland historically and culturally. David Worthington points out that Scotland's geography and location, where, and I quote from the slide, salt water is never more than 50 miles away, make it an ideal site for literal explorations. Scotland's geographical borders are significantly literal in nature, and this leads to some locational and political uncertainties. On the coastlines, the political borders of Scotland and the UK converge. Geologically, the coastal border around Scotland is maybe the most frayed border of the UK, as you can see on the map as well. And it's not just because of the unruly irregularities of the sinuous shore of the mainland, but also because of the sprawl of dispersed islands in almost every direction, which complicates a clear location of the border geographically and politically. Many islanders have historically sought allegiances across the North Sea, locating themselves outside of mainland Scotland and Britain, and stressing the historical and cultural connection with Scandinavia instead. To the south, the terraqueous connections are not less pronounced. The Anglo-Scottish border runs along several waterways. Beginning at the Solway Firth in the west, the border converges with several rivers, including the rivers Sark and Esk, Liddell Water, the Kirkshire Burn, and finally the Tweed, before running into the North Sea to the east. This intersection between political borders and literary zones creates a set of literary affordances that enable writers to engage with wider debates about literary borders and contribute new imaginative perspectives on how they might be reimagined. My first example, Carroll and Duffy's River, situates itself at the bend of a strategically unnamed Anglo-Scottish border river, which separates two language communities. The poem examines the border through water and considers how language changes into a different babel as the river turns, highlighting the overlap between natural and political borders captured by the river and emphasizing the border crossing ability of water. Able to speak all languages, the river's water translates itself while words stumble, fall back. A border river, Edward Casey argues, should be seen as a drifting and shifting border in which the meaning of natural and national becomes conflated, turning the river into an artificial natural hybrid. In Duffy's poem, the river similarly takes on a hybrid role with political and linguistic meanings imposed on it, but its fluid instability is soon shown to undermine its bordering effect. A shift in language alone signals the border in the poem, fastened to a sign nailed to a tree next to the river, while the river itself resists its bordering function. The border in Duffy's poem is an arbitrary political construct constituted through conventions and signs. When communication appears to fail based on linguistic differences, the speaker suggests that it may become possible after all by availing oneself of the connective quality of the border water. Rather than relying on human language and meaning-making, the speaker asks the readers to imagine building a connection with a woman on the other side by dangling your own hands in the water where blue and silver fish dart away over stone, stein, like the meanings of things vanish. The linguistically established border may thus be overcome through an embodied allegiance with water, by becoming fluent in more than one sense. The final evocation of words written on the sand near where the river runs into the sea further highlights the volatility of borders, built upon the fundaments of human language, which is subject to a continual deferral of meaning that can be lost in translation. This is my second example, similarly set in the Borders region, but on the western end of the Anglo-Scottish border, closer to the Solway Firth, is John Buchan's short story, Streams of Water in the South. which is in the Watcher by the Threshold collection. The short story explores in more detail the potential for ontological questioning and material repositioning that emerges from literal perspectives. The Borders region, as portrayed by Bochen, is characterized by an abundance of rivers, creeks, burns, and other waterways. The story centers around the unique capability of the tramp Adam Logan to connect with water and to cross almost every waterway that he encounters. Throughout the story, it becomes clear that Logan, prior to this, had never encountered a ford that he could not cross, not until the ending. At the end of the story, Logan wanders farther off from his local environment than usual and is encountered by a shepherd on the shores of the Solway Firth. The shepherd explains that he's looking towards the Atlantic Ocean, a saltwater estuary it's impossible to cross. Though Logan perceives the smell of the Solway as cold and unfriendly, he's seen wading determinedly into the sea the next morning in a final and fatal attempt at border crossing. The aqueous border of the Solway is thus categorically different from the other literal borders Logan crosses with ease, not only physically, but also conceptually. Choosing the Solway as the final border water to be crossed, Bochen taps into a literary tradition of writing about the Solway as mobile, flexible, and a dangerously unstable border. The tragic ending of the story transfers the ontological questionings raised about the nature of borders, water, and the connection between human and non-human to the Solway and its double functioning as a natural national border that may be crossed by some and not by others. Logan's impression of the Solway's smell as cold and unfriendly may be explained through its saltwater materiality that he's not used to, but it similarly speaks to the political meaning of the Solway as a border that comes with histories, processes, and regulations that could merit these adjectives. Exploring the possibilities of border crossing through literal zones and waters, the short story thus raises questions about how borders may be recognized and by whom, who is able to cross them, how, and why. It points both to the potentiality of literal zones to allow for the transgression of borders and the limitations of fluid imaginaries. Both Duffy's poem and Bochen's short story develop formal techniques that are literal in quality, but they are, of course, only two examples in a non-exhaustive list, and these are some of the other texts that I look at in the book, or that I could come up with, and I'm sure you could come up with some others. Another literary form that has been mobilised to think through Scotland in order to reconfigure borders along environmental lines, and that I want to illuminate briefly here, is the form of planetarity. The notion of planetarity has become central to today's environmental movement and the conceptualization of the current geological age of the Anthropocene. More so than global and transnational approaches, planetarity asks us to take agents beyond the human into consideration and to expand our perspective towards the animal, vegetal, and mineral agents with which we share this planet. The Anthropocene requires us to rethink our frames of reference and to adopt a planetary perspective, but this imperative is accompanied by a range of conceptual and practical difficulties. As Timothy Clark argues, even though, and I quote Clark here, the planetary scale of the Anthropocene compels us to think and act as if we were already citizens of a world polity, it is often the opposite that happens. The environmental crisis becomes a matter of political allegiance and of personal opinion. One of the difficulties in conceptualizing planetarity is the sheer impossibility of evaluating the effects of even the smallest, most insignificant actions or phenomena. As Clark puts it, the Anthropocene manifests itself in, quote, innumerable possible hairline cracks in the familiar life world. Critics like Clark and Amitav Ghosh as well have described this condition that is created by the Anthropocene as leading to a crisis of the imagination, a sense that our literary and cultural forms are inadequate to the scale and complexity of planetary reality. The literary works I've been reading make me skeptical of this framing. Rather than being overwhelmed by the burden of communicating planetary realities, the works that I've looked at engage with planetarity in creative, playful, and critical ways. They use Scotland's geography, environment, and history to rethink borders from the geopolitical to the material along planetary lines. While they certainly grapple with conceptual challenges, they don't offer neat solutions. Instead, they embrace the messiness, confusion, and contradictions that come with adapting a planetary perspective, and they invite readers to engage in the sometimes disorienting process of making sense of our shared position on this planet. At the same time, they show us the value of planetary perspectives for reimagining traditional bordering paradigms. Moving away from established bordering frameworks dominant to reading Scotland as well, such as the core periphery model that's often used to talk about Scotland's borders. They build alternative perspectives by looking at an environmental framing, and they offer fantastical alternative futures against which the presumed universality and the permanence of human bordering practices appears trite and insignificant. So again, I'll give you two examples of writers who do this. So this is my first example, the 1925 poem, The Eamistane by MacDiarmid, which presents us with a disorienting view of Earth, seen from both within and from outside planetary habitation. You got the original version on the left, and you got a standard English translation, if you will, on the right, and that's offered by MacDiarmid himself. The opening line we get here roots us in time and space. The speaker stands in the Howdom date of the Coldhurst night. Sorry about my bad Scots. Presumably gazing up at the night sky of the harvest. But almost immediately, we realize that in looking up, the speaker is also looking down, and we are suddenly presented with an image of Earth as an Eamistane, a shaky stone that's moving through the sky. This double vision is deeply unsettling. The speaker tries to recall eerie memories, but they fall upside down like a Jodendrift, a counterswirl of fallen snow that drifts back up from the Earth. This Jodendrift not only confuses the speaker's memories, but also makes it impossible to read an inscription that seems to be cut out in the stone of the Earth itself. Even without the disorienting snow, the speaker admits, the words would be unreadable, already buried under the moss and lichen of history. And the immensity of the planet and the universe, the poem suggests, words become meaningless. The inscription in the stone cannot be read, and even if it could, it would be incapable of expressing planetary reality. Here, Scots is not just a source of rootedness in contrast to a more global English, but a language whose environmental vocabulary, with words like Jodendrift, permits the feelings of disorientation that are central to MacDiarmid's planetary perspective. MacDiarmid's poetry draws on Scotland's cultural, political, linguistic, and environmental affordances to develop such planetary perspectives. By combining the planetary with an attachment to the local, writers such as MacDiarmid resist scalar thinking and a totalizing perspective that the global is often criticized for. They show that planetary consciousness can emerge from a deep engagement with the local environment. My second example, Margaret Elphinstone's A Sparrow's Flight, imagines a society arising from the capitalist ruins of a nuclear fallout. The result is a seemingly pre-industrial world infused with a sense of enchantment that makes the novel appear almost like a fantasy novel. It quickly becomes clear that what readers at the time and today would consider everyday technology has become unknown and is perceived as dangerous. In this world, the fiddler Naomi travels north across the debatable lands, or what used to be the debatable lands, to the so-called empty lands, in the company of Thomas, who's looking to return home to join a traditional dance from which Naomi is to play the music. In Elphinstone's post-apocalyptic world, familiar categories and structuring principles come undone. The road on which Thomas and Naomi travel seems to move organically, further defamiliarizing the landscape. The narrative, and this is on the slide, describes the land as more like the sea, a long swell of hills, their curves smooth as a whale's back, birds circling over them, the cry of curlews desolate as the calling of gulls over open water. The land is limitless, shaped by climate and time rather than by human hands. Even though the nations of England and Scotland no longer exist in the novel, the territorial conflicts along the Anglo-Scottish border are still recorded in the environment, and that can be felt by Thomas. The borderland between England and Scotland, once a geopolitical dividing line, thus serves as a foundation for the novel's destabilization of conceptual and physical borders. And the most obvious example is maybe this next passage. Naomi, who has no concept of borders, is baffled when Thomas describes to her the purpose of Hadrian's Wall, which they travel north of. What wall? Naomi asks. It does what we do, only further south. It crosses the whole land from one side to another. No, said Naomi, considering. It can't do. What for? To divide one country from another. But why? The mountains do that. Land makes divisions, then people make connections between them. A wall like that would be going the wrong way. So in Elphinstone's borderless world, the very function of borders is questioned, while conceptual borders between reality and dream, past and present, human and non-human, become equally fluid. As they enter the empty lands, Thomas declares that they have reached the border of his country. But because the borders lack any physical markers, Naomi cannot make sense of this declaration. Naomi's borderless vision of the world, in which humans create connections rather than divisions, allows her to tap into a planetary consciousness after they arrive in the empty lands. Walking on the hills and looking down into the valley of Thomas's village, the unfamiliar surroundings disorient Naomi, and they shift her perspective beyond the human. So this is this passage. It was like stepping out of a magic circle into a dimension that had nothing to do with the world she knew. The floor of the valley looked quite smooth from here, like a spinning top. It had spun her out of one world into another, and there was no telling where she was. She looked at the mountains opposite, trying to remember their names. That reorientated her. There were still signposts, and they only seemed to have changed. This metaphor of altered signposts suggests that she reoriented her perspective and can now explore the world from an alternative point of view. The landscape twirls from valley to mountains to the rough plateau, curving around and forming a path that Naomi feels is heading directly towards the moon. Naomi feels that the sky seems to expand right down to her feet, encompassing her as though space had overflowed its limits and reached down to touch the earth. She loses her identity in the vastness of the spatial expansion as a new world opens up to her and encloses her within itself. She seems to lose her color and becomes no different from the rocks. By losing herself like this briefly, Naomi gains a new understanding of her position, and she is able to relocate herself within the living world of planetary relations in this final passage. The earth was alive, and it was the same earth wherever she might be. There was a music to it beyond the range of human ears, but within the compass of her body. She couldn't hear it, but she recognized it, a vibration too vast for any instrument, spinning out into space, the beginning and end of every human tune, the sound of home. So Elphinstone's mystical future-past version of the Anglo-Scottish borderlands catalyzes the dissolution of borders as structuring principles. The shifting quality of this narrative and the estrangement of familiar categories highlight the incommensurable condition of planetary habitation. The narrative embraces confusion and discomfort, and it is through embodied affective encounters with the intensely local that the characters recognize themselves as part of a complex planetary meshwork. By situating planetary thought within the local, such writing does not attempt to fix or stabilize the planet, but instead it grounds the planetary in the local, understanding the local as a node in the meshwork of planetary relations. The local here is not categorically different from the planetary, but it always already exists within an understanding of the planet. And again, these are just two examples from a non-exhaustive list. Some of the other examples I've looked at are on the slide here. And I think writers like McDermott and Elphinstone develop a conception of planetarity that emerges from the qualities of Scotland's local geography and environment. They emerge from the earth itself rather than looking at the earth from the outside. They resist the temptation to offer clear solutions and stable answers, and they invite us to inhabit the messiness and confusion of planetary consciousness, to embrace contradictions and disorientations that come with recognizing our place on a shared planet. And in doing that, they offer us new ways of imagining the relationship between borders, environments, and planetary belonging, ways that are rooted in the specificities of place, but that also resonate far beyond Scotland's borders. So let me get to my concluding reflections on literary methods. And these are some of the central facts that I've built my ideas on. So reflecting on the persistence of borders across history and how these borders shape our perspectives on the world, and fabricating truth and presenting us with an invented version of reality, border studies scholar Henk van Houten wonders how, instead of trying to do away with borders, we might instead begin to remake them. So rather provocatively, maybe Van Houten asks us to reflect on our ability to dream borders differently. And this is Van Houten. Do we dare deborder ourselves? Do we dare to embrace the untamed freedom, but with the preservation of certainty, comfort, and ease? Do we dare to cross the border of the imagined dark forest out there and enter the forest without fear? Or does the forest exist precisely because of our stories about it? Is it a road to familiar openness? Is a road to familiar openness thinkable, dreamable? And I would argue that literature provides us with a space that allows us to experience the freedom of debordering ourselves by entering and immersing ourselves in the life worlds of a fictional realm and its human and non-human characters. And it also gives us comfort and certainty at the same time. By inviting us to reflect on our assumptions about the world and our own enmeshment within it, the borders we draw, not just between us and the world, but between one another, literature has the power to offer us thinkable and dreamable alternatives to the way borders, the environment, and the relation between the two are commonly understood. As literary scholars, the conversations that exist between such literary works, as I've looked at, might also ask us to revisit our methods. We often tend to think about literature in kind of containers, so periods, national traditions, genres. And I'd like us to recognize the potential of moving beyond such traditional historicist and national frameworks to foster unusual and maybe often surprising connections. When I began working on my research project, I thought it would turn out completely different. I have a background in cultural studies, and I believe that the most productive way to analyze this relationship between borders and the environment would be a historicist approach. So I wanted to find out about the history of the relationship, how it had developed since the 19th century, and put that in relation to emergent structures of feeling and sociopolitical changes. At the same time, I always felt the kind of discomfort with structuring my book that contained all this research, centrally concerned with the non-human world, according to these arbitrary human period markers that didn't quite fit with the environmental topic of it. And I also struggled with seeing the connection between bordering processes and environmental politics reflected in the literary works that I read. It wasn't so easy to just see those developing together. So at some point I came across Caroline Levine's forms, and I was immediately taken by how literary form allowed me to see connections in ways that theory and history didn't. So it was stepping back from the comfort zone of historicist analysis that allowed me to what Levine calls, to kind of see what Levine has called surprising and unintentional political effects that forms can produce. At the same time, that was also quite challenging because it required a different kind of reading and researching that I was used to or trained for. And many of the works that I discuss in my book were serendipitous finds, because looking for forms that would articulate the relationship between borders and the environment in the way that I'm looking at it would not allow me a kind of systematic compilation of a corpus, as just doing a historical analysis would have done. So I was required to take a step back from classifying my works into neat categories. And my supervisor always used to say, Julia likes to take risks, which, you know, wasn't very comforting, but I guess that's what it was. So instead of organizing my book by literary or historical periods, I decided to focus on literary forms. And I started by thinking about which forms I might find. So I came up with things like periphery, scale, temporality, land, the creaturely, drawing on what I'd learned from theory and history. But then I sat down with the text and I found I didn't fit these categories neatly. So the literary works kind of pushed back, and I realized I needed to let them speak for themselves to really get at what they were doing. And this allowed me to see that, for example, Willem Uwer's sense of time was part of a broader literal aesthetic, that Nan Shepherd's writing resisted being read in terms of scale and instead felt planetary, and that Jan Buchan merged concerns with land and the creaturely into something that I would later call territory. So I let these literary forms guide me to discover new and unexpected connections between texts. I had to give them the space to unfold their meaning, or in Henk van Houtem's works that are cited here on the slide, I had to de-border myself and let go of my critical assumptions. This process, which asked me to continually reflect on the stories and fictions that I brought to the texts I was reading, made me wonder how often our scholarly reading practices preclude the possibility of unbordering ourselves and of dreaming different borders. The result is a methodological intervention that I didn't quite intend at the beginning, and I didn't quite foresee. And I was only able to make this because I let the literature take me with it in a collaborative process. But as I like to believe, it was also this approach that yielded the most productive results and the most productive understanding of Scotland's affordances for fostering literary imaginaries that that reshape and orient the relationship between borders and the environment. So by focusing on literary forms and environmental perspectives, I believe we can uncover new ways of understanding Scottish literature and its relevance for contemporary cultural and critical debates. These approaches illuminate how Scottish literature and literary form can come to matter in a variety of interdisciplinary, theoretical, and political contexts. This approach, I believe, offers valuable insights into how literature can help us navigate and reconfigure our understanding of borders and the environment in the 21st century, and it can help us rethink the categories that we use to border not just our world, but also our scholarly disciplines. Thank you.